Hello, and welcome back to the Diogenes Podcast. Today, I would like to share an excerpt from the first chapter of my forthcoming book, Emphatic Caprices. The chapter is entitled TDS equals Tedious. It seems the party of social justice just doesn't know the difference between prosecution and persecution, or between appropriate policy opposition and ad hominem attacks. Whatever happened to Michelle Obama's when they go low, we go high? The former First Lady explained that, quote, going high means finding a purpose in your rage. Rage without reason, without a plan, without direction, is just more rage. I'm trying to push us to think about solutions that will actually unite us and get us focused on the real problems, end quote. Sounds great. But that was in 2016. Here is what happened to Michelle Obama in 2024. She became opportunistically radicalized and joined the woke parade. Speaking at the DNC on behalf of candidate Kamala Harris, Obama pandered to the starry-eyed congregation and traduced the designated opponents of the chosen people. We will never benefit from the affirmative action of generational wealth, says a former First Lady worth $70 million. One can only hope that Sasha and Malia will see some benefit from such largesse. If we bankrupt a business or choke in a crisis, we don't get a second, third, or fourth chance, says the woman whose husband, a two-term president, bailed out Wall Street after one of the biggest financial hornswoggles in history. If things don't go our way, we don't have the luxury of whining or cheating others to get further ahead. Yet there was a party in the house with the Obamas during COVID lockdown where many important and powerful guests swirled amidst the fete. We don't get to change the rules, so we always win. Really? Isn't that what critical race theory and DEI are all about? It seems to be working. If we see a mountain in front of us, we don't expect to see an escalator waiting to take us to the top. Such exalted people needn't rely on such archaic methods. They can just float right up, high on their own supply. And finally, quote, my mom, in her steady, quiet way, lived out that striving sense of hope every single day of her life. She and my father didn't aspire to be wealthy. In fact, they were suspicious of folks who took more than they needed, end quote. This from a woman who commands $750,000 per speech and who owns estates in D.C., Hyde Park, and on Martha's Vineyard. I would say that these tendentious assertions beg many questions, but there's no need to beg when the answers and the audience have already been paid for. The we, emphasized by the former First Lady, clearly means Black, BIPOC, and minorities. And the implied they is not an alphabet person, although she gets to those later in her address. Nope, she means Caucasians, or as the woke youth call us these days, YT people, as if we're still numbered among the hominids. We're monsters, in case you don't do TikTok. This just goes to show that bigotry is always the color of shit, no matter the complexion of the asshole producing it, a maneuver best accomplished by going low. Here's where it gets personal. I was born a bastard out of Appalachia, which, by the way, is the correct pronunciation, in 1968, and I was raised by an alcoholic single mother alongside 3 much older children from her prior marriage. She was also caring for her own mother, who was succumbing to dementia. My father was an up-and-coming public figure, attorney, soon-to-be state tax commissioner, professor of law and business, and head of a state organization that managed millions of dollars in public grants and subsidies for the arts and education. By a cruel twist of fate, he came into possession of the deed for the home my mother's father had built for her and evicted my then-pregnant mother and our family. A successful breach of promise suit brought a small settlement, but released my father from any further financial obligation to my mother or to me. I never met him. Purchasing a small house, within 2 years our neighbors burned a cross on our lawn because my hippie brother brought undesirable friends into the neighborhood. Forced to move after repeated threats to our safety, the rest of my childhood and adolescence were spent in cheap apartments and housing projects, on and off public assistance, as my mother divided her time between crawling into and crawling out of a bottle. I witnessed and experienced physical violence in and outside my family. Between the ages of 6 and 10, I was repeatedly sexually abused by both men and women, sometimes with family awareness, but never intervention. I grew up mostly without a family car or a telephone. Our utilities were often disconnected. By age 11, my siblings long gone, my mother would skip meals to feed me, and dinner was often beans and cornbread or eggs, toast, and milk for weeks at a time. At the age of 12, I attempted suicide. In 6th grade, my glasses broke, and my mother couldn't afford to replace them. I was given an old pair by a neighbor, not the right prescription, but better than nothing. They were too big. They kept falling off my face. So I spent my first year of junior high in a new school, in a new state, trying to see the chalkboard with a jagged, dime-sized piece of broken prescription glass. By the time I reached 9th grade, which I never completed, I had been in 13 different schools in 4 different states. At that point, I had already moved 15 times. In what should have been my sophomore year of high school, my mother and I were evicted from an apartment owned by my sister's boyfriend. For several months, we lived in a motel room paid for by the Salvation Army. I was placed on legal probation for not attending school, and when I turned 16, expelled. My train wreck of a childhood belied the fact that I learned to read at age 2, and in the 4th grade was reading at college level and being assigned 8th grade work in all subjects. There was talk of moving me up to the high school or to a special center for gifted children, but the geographical cure sent us to another state. At 16, I attempted suicide again and enjoyed a brief stay in the hospital. At 17, I enrolled at the local community college and went on to complete 3 undergraduate programs summa cum laude, then earned a master's degree from a top-tier private college. I taught for 25 years, 20 of them as an adjunct professor, designing original courses combining studio art with English and philosophy. I left my job in 2021 because of the COVID panic and the woke politics that have engulfed higher education and every other institution in the U.S. In 2023, I was invited to apply for a new tenure-track position by the Dean of Humanities at my former school. I did, and assembled a stellar application package. I was given a bogus interview with less than 24 hours' notice, and 2 months later received a rejection I had to inquire after myself. As it turned out, the school hired someone with literally 1/10 my teaching experience, but more than double the melanin. Incidentally, there was another highly qualified in-house paleface adjunct with 20-plus years of experience who was also passed over for the position. What could this possibly mean? Here's a hint. Having seen the winning candidate's online portfolio and read his statements, it is indisputable that he is not a professional peer of myself or my former colleague, although he has created his own Wikipedia page. He is, however, a dedicated academic activist, handy, if not especially capable, with art school jabberwokery, and whose sullen craft services the concerns du jour. Root household merits, RHM, cultural introspection wealth, CIW, and ecological design services, EDS. I'd say you can't make this shit up, but you kind of have to. And I don't know what these mean either, or what they have to do with making or teaching art, but they do sound important. Throw in a little Gullah Geechee, look it up, and you've got a golden ticket from the Outer Banks to the Inner Circle. Let me be clear. I have nothing personally against this gentleman. I don't even know him. He may be a wonderful human being and an excellent teacher, but this is a matter of how and why he was hired, and the number of now salient ideological and identitarian boxes he checked as a candidate is suspicious. For additional data on progressive stacking, readers and listeners may wish to consult the long-listed authors for the 2025 National Book Award for Poetry: African, woman, 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 Black trans woman, i.e. biological gay male, woman, and queer Palestinian. Of course, they're nominated solely for their surpassingly excellent verse. Identity has nothing to do with it, and shame on you for thinking so. I later learned that my former dean, who encouraged me to try out for this position, is no longer willing to write recommendations for me after many years of support, effectively canceling my candidacy for any future teaching work in higher education. Perhaps she and Michelle Obama had been talking. In any case, I know which one was listening. This is a long and garish overshare. Trauma dumping, the Zoomers call it, but I think it makes an imperative point and is at least slightly less grotesque than my unworthy successor's aura farming, which is Zoomer for performative coolness. My circumstances have been very far from privileged, and certainly did not enable my success as such things are usually defined, something which professionally still eludes me. As of this writing, I am an unemployed 58-year-old straight white male with respectable credentials and experience who is now an undesirable candidate in his profession owing to immutable characteristics and wrong think. How now, brown cow? That said, it is a foregone conclusion that if my genitals were involuted and self-lubricating, or my name were Dequarius, or my pronouns unpronounceable, my career would have blazed and ascended in academic glory like Joan of Woke. But my real point is that the truly awful events of my early life left indelible marks on me, but I'm not a victim. With the help of remarkably generous people whom I have encountered along the way, I've persevered and worked hard to survive and excel, propelled by an indomitable will to see what I can accomplish, not because I have anything to prove to anyone or feel entitled to anything, but because the world will not let me waste time on anything other than my own best efforts. There are zero reasons to presume that any support I have received or any success I have achieved are in any way related to my race, sex, preferences, or proclivities beyond a willingness to learn and to work, along with a little luck. Such attainments as I may have made are also not due to any strategic capacity for complaint or the bestowal of unearned advantages based on suffering or disenfranchisement by me or anyone who looks like me. Whatever I have earned or have gained by blind chance, and whatever I lack is due to tough luck, trade-offs, or is simply beyond my circumstances or capacities. Que sera, sera. Of course, this is true only up to the recent rupture of reality by woke ideologues who have gamed the system and changed the rules in their cultural coup d'etat. The active exclusion and persecution of straight white males and the politically heterodox of all shapes, sizes, colors, and preferences for nookie are a real and present threat to life and livelihood. But I'm not wasting my time complaining about my plight. I'm fighting back. In a remarkable book entitled Happy, Why More or Less Everything is Absolutely Fine, mentalist Darren Brown draws on sources from Stoicism to Schopenhauer to elucidate the timeless insight that well-being lies not in things or social status, but in our attitude toward experience. Noting that we are equally vulnerable to venerating positive thinking as well as wallowing in the mire, Brown warns that, quote, the mantra of you can be anything creates more pain than pleasure, end quote. The rosy-tinted fantasies of such human potential movement pablum, he cautions, quote, posits us as wailing infants, trusting that a maternal, nurturing universe will provide for our every need if we only cry loudly enough, end quote. Indeed. And the rose-colored glasses transition smoothly and swiftly into oppression goggles, trademark, that see only bigotry and injustice when the narcissistic bubble inevitably bursts and we are left to cope without accountability for our own condition. Brown takes to task the excessively self-congratulatory for glossing over the random factors that form a significant part of every success, instead preferring to filter through the details of their experiences for, quote, evidence of deservedness, end quote. Just as legendary in their own minds, of course, are the tragic heroes of the woke mythos, the elect losers of the oppression Olympics, superhuman in repurposing abuses minor and imaginary, historical and hysterical, into tokens for riding up Michelle Obama's golden escalator. Both narratives rely on sampling bias and attribution error. For all those who succeed wildly, there are many more with equal or even greater merits whose earnest efforts do not. And among those who adorn themselves with the meretricious bling of systemic persecution and reap social credits, There are legions who don't have time to complain because tomorrow is another working day. Many's the time I've been mistaken, and many times confused. Yes, and I've often felt forsaken, and certainly misused. And I don't know a soul who's not been battered. I don't have a friend who feels at ease. I don't know a dream that's not been shattered or driven to its knees. That was Paul Simon from An American Tune in 1973. What makes these fallacious narratives into such a peculiarly American tune, as Ryman Simon put it, is the consumerist fantasy at their heart. The idea that the self fulfilled is a prosperous, powerful, widely recognized, and imperishable ideal image of a self, an image of desire, desiring its own consumption as an image. In other words, the American dream, which, as George Carlin Riley observed, is something you have to be asleep to believe in. Having to be woke and live the dream must truly be an unbearable burden, which would explain the fatigue we keep hearing about so much these days. Author Mary Frances Winters defines Black fatigue as, quote, repeated variations of stress that result in extreme exhaustion and cause mental, physical, and spiritual maladies that are passed down from generation to generation, end quote. I believe this exists, although it used to be called the human condition. And I believe it can become weaponized and be used as a form of intergroup coercion and grievance stoking when practiced by those with low accountability, low conscientiousness, and a perverse insistence on an external locus of control, increasingly accompanied by cries for social justice. But the onus is on the individual to adapt to the terrain, not on society to pave the way through to a perfect life. Darren Brown observes, quote, life is largely a catalog of embarrassments and failures to do oneself justice. What a task to still pursue something worthwhile and try to take responsibility amidst one's mess, end quote. Of course, people get worn down and worn out by relentless adversity, but it is cognitive behavioral therapy in reverse to invent an entire psychological category as a safe space from which to shout incessant demands for rescue. This is usually done while seizing upon the smallest instances of perceived slights to build, grain by grain, a wall between oneself and the cruel world to justify further complaint about not being able to participate in that world. This is exhausting for everyone, hence the uptake of the term Black fatigue by those who are tired of excuses, nonsense, and bad behavior. Speaking of worn-out tires, Ta-Nehisi Coates, certified genius and one of the greasy avatars of identitarian grievance, calls his memoir The Beautiful Struggle. But in a long-form letter to his adolescent son, the mythological rumination Between the World and Me, Coates parenthetically frames his narrative in loss and sadness, the loss of his body to the exploitation of a false democracy, and the sadness of struggling dreamers in the ghettos where the rain is coming down in sheets. Somewhere in between, he speaks of, quote, the Mecca, the vastness of Black people across space-time, end quote, and how, in that sacred place, quote, we are without fear, are the dark spectrum on parade, end quote. Well, we can see that now. From TNC all the way to the DNC, the Black millionaires pivot from their lamentation, quote, like an outcast song, painted in lust and joy, end quote. In fact, that seemed to be the message for America at the 2024 Democratic National Convention. Let them eat joy! Because vibes will get you through times of bad policy better than policy will get you through times of bad vibes. Incidentally, at the opening night of the convention, the aggregate message revolved more around the telltale orange vortex of bad vibes himself rather than any substantive declarations of policy. Trump was mentioned a total of 147 times, compared to 27 references to the economy, 8 combined remarks on prices and inflation, 8 mentions of the border crisis, and 6 comments on crime. Then sitting President Joe Biden, remember him? That's okay, he doesn't either, was mentioned just twice in 4 days. Glad to see they had their priorities straight. But this is not joy, it's hate. And it's not just contempt for Trump, but for the people who reject the left as the best or the only path forward, a path paved with the pre-engraved tombstones of every victim who will ever live, whose holy names must be intoned in reverence forever along the road to woke utopia. This is a sacred story, as all religious and ideological narratives are, as likely to confound as to converge upon consensus. Quote, "You don't have a narrative, narrative has you," end quote, writes Jonathan Haidt, author of The Story Paradox. Quote, "Narrative is for making sense of the world, and it does so by simplifying the world. All narrative is reductionist. And once we have a narrative that's giving coherence and order to our existence, we typically defend it with half-blind vigor," end quote. We are told by stories, what to tell ourselves about ourselves, and especially about others. Almost none of the information we have about the world was discovered directly and personally. Gottschall notes that this was told to us, or a telling was discovered and then accepted. At an exponentially increasing rate, this is done through the bullshit superspreader of the internet. But the responsibility lies with individuals to develop the discernment and skepticism necessary to rise above the simplified narratives and holy writ of partisan spin. Everyone has convictions regarding the correctness of their own stories, as individuals, as tribes, as bodies politic. But the woke especially rely on the authenticity and presumed authority of lived experience, of standpoints and intersectionality to tell stories that must be accepted without question. Meanwhile, they are not only free, but righteously charged to challenge all other narratives. There's a name for this kind of story: bullshit. Quote, "As conscious beings, we exist only in response to other things, and we cannot know ourselves at all without knowing them. Facts about ourselves are not peculiarly solid and resistant to skeptical dissolution. Our natures are, indeed, elusively insubstantial, notoriously less stable than the natures of other things. And insofar as this is the case, sincerity itself is bullshit," end quote. My own story has more in common with the hillbilly elegy of J.D. Vance than with Mr. Coates's homilies, and not just because I too hail from Appalachia. Vance honestly acknowledges that success does not just happen, even when one is talented and hungry for it. It requires social capital, which, contra Michelle Obama, is not always given in advance or built from stealing someone else's opportunities. It is acquired a small piece at a time through often excruciating risk, failure, and perseverance. Hiding, wallowing, or preparing for battle might help one survive a traumatic childhood, as Vance himself observes, but these tendencies are often prohibitive of adult achievement, and they tend both to cut one off and bring others down. If Democrats and the woke truly want to, quote, "think about solutions that will unite us," end quote, as Michelle Obama said, and lift up those who struggle, no matter their color, they might take a more liberal approach. Casting oneself as a perpetual victim and outsider is a studied justification for withdrawal with an expectation of rescue. It is a mindset that breeds hostility, contempt, and a need for constant self-gratification. Casting oneself as a rebel or a hierophant also justifies withdrawal from personal and social responsibilities as one retreats behind the mask of righteousness, forming judgments and plotting retaliations. In these days, the more melanotic and uterine the accuser, and the more arcane their parts of speech, the greater the presumed veracity of their claims and luxury beliefs. As for Mrs. Obama's concern with the demonizing of children for, quote, "just being who they are," end quote, that is, in need of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, sterilization, and genital mutilation on demand, along with the free abortion pills and vasectomies that were offered outside the DNC, I'll have to save my extended comments for another book. Suffice it to say for now that I am pro-choice, but I oppose double standards. If wealthy people can pretend to be poor, MacArthur Genius Grant winners can pretend to be victims, and children can pretend to be the opposite sex, then I should be able to pretend to be black and get a tenured professorship and a Nobel Prize, or at least a lucrative beer or sneaker partnership. It worked for Tiny Hissy, Barry O, and Mr. Mulvaney, so why not me? The left clearly no longer understand the efficacy of offering a competent and charismatic candidate of their own to sway the hearts and minds of the electorate, about most of whom they have long since ceased to care. If Trump fails, it should be on his own political demerits, not through grievance-hustling identity politics and blatant banana republic tactics the self-righteous left don't even bother to conceal. Remember, if you enjoy the content on the Diogenes podcast, please like and subscribe and tell your friends to join the pack. Also, drop your thoughts in the comments section, but remember to do so respectfully. We believe in free speech here in the Diogenes podcast, but slurs are not arguments, and trolling is not a meaningful contribution to discourse. In any case, thanks for joining us.